So with that idea and a change in how our leadership was talking about strategy, shifting it from, win at all costs to winning will be an outcome of a cultural shift, that led to a recognition. If you're going to ask me to create these sort of cross-boundary relationships, then how am I getting to know this team? How are we going to communicate? How do I interact with them? Because it won't be on a sort of a daily basis. It won't be in the hallway, right? And so the communications model started to change. That was the next real shift in this organizational evolution that our leadership oversaw. And so, traditionally, any big bureaucracy like we were had been on this sort of, imagine your business's daily, weekly, quarterly, annual cadence, right? It's not that much different in the military. There's the big Friday meeting, there's the quarterly sort of review, there's the annual strategy stuff that happens. So not dissimilar in the world that I grew up inside of special operations. And so there was a recognition that cadence is not going to be sufficient, right? And so a way that this is often discussed in the military would be, at least the system I grew up in, was this idea of, strategic level comms at the senior leadership. If you think about that through a traditional bureaucratic lens, like here's my executive C-suite, they're focused on strategy. Then I've got my operational folks, that sort of mid-man doing the day-to-day stuff, and then I have my tactical leadership or frontline individual contributors. Every organization of scale has some version of this. Senior leadership, mid-management, keeping things moving, and then my frontline folks out in the market, right? And they're all sort of going forward in time, and they're coordinating on these sort of different wavelengths, right? My long-term strategic thinking, my sort of daily, weekly, monthly cadence here that's a little more organized, and then very staccato down here at the bottom as I'm jumping from opportunity to opportunity, right? And so it's kind of this funky EKG report if you really think about how your organization interacts. And we keep them organized through, in a traditional bureaucratic way over time in a pretty simple model, not easy in execution, but, my senior leadership makes a decision, they send it to mid-management to sort of clean it up a little bit, and they push it down to the frontline folks who say, here's what the bosses want us to do, and then your teams out here go do it, right? And they close a deal, they hire a new team member, they, get some new resourcing, whatever it may be, all these sort of things start to happen. They then map those over to like how it's changing their plan or what they're seeing, new opportunities, whatever it may be. They put that into a nice report or have a conference call back to the management team here. That eventually works its way up to senior leadership, and they make another set of informed decisions, right? And so that cascades up and down the organization. Super effective way to keep, a bureaucratic system, an organization of tens of thousands nicely organized if you can follow that process well. And one of the dependent variables then is, do I have the right people along each line of that, right? Do I have the right frontline folks and great teams? Do I have the right bosses above them? Is my mid-management and rising next generation of senior management making sense of all this noise, et cetera, right? So there's a human dynamic that sits along all the parts of this curve. That was great, but what we found was it was also insufficient, so I'll clean that up just a little bit. We didn't want to get rid of that, right? Remember, because we talked about going to this idea of a hybrid structure between the two, right? And so I don't want to necessarily just immediately get rid of my traditional way of doing business, because this is pretty effective, right? And a lot of organizations have been doing this for a long time to great success, right? So, and in the military, certainly the world I grew up in, what existed on this line that really worked well was, my supply chain, my budget planning when I'm interacting with big systems like the Pentagon, my ability to interact with allied nations, right? Other big partners that have their own bureaucratic structures, right? And a lot of those decisions aren't super time sensitive. If they're happening on a monthly or quarterly or sometimes even an annual or further out cadence, that's fine. So let's not say that everything that moves this slowly is terrible. But we started to recognize, back to the earlier part of this conversation, there are networks that are also part of the problem, and they're also moving forward in time. And so if the only way we have to coordinate is a system that looks like this red line here, then we're not going to be able to move fast enough against those sort of dynamic problems. So if I take a small team and I put them out into the environment, or I make a decision here, it gets passed through mid-management, I say, okay, go do the following thing, they're going to, in that world, literally step out into the environment, interact with the problem, but the last clear snapshot of what we had, the sense we had of that problem, is dated back to what it looked like here, right? So, which may be 2 days old, 3 days old, a week old. In some parts of industry, maybe it's a month or a quarter old, right? Because this information flow takes a long time to go up and down and across. And so this team is going out into environment looking for this or to address here, but what their understanding is it looks like this.